All right, welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're switching gears here to hear from the Agency of Digital Services. And I think we're having all of our testimony via Zoom today. I'll give Secretary Naylor a moment to come on here. There it is. Ta-da.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right?
We can. I think Andrew's just going to turn your volume up a little bit. We've always got to dial it in when folks start on Zoom each day. So welcome, Secretary Naylor. And I don't know if you would like to introduce your team, but I will turn it over to you to hear about your FY24 proposals.
Excellent. Thank you. So for the record, Sean Naylor, Secretary, Agency of Digital Services. With me today is Kate Slocum, our Chief Financial Officer, and also Josiah Raish, our Artificial Intelligence Director. So when we get done the compelling testimony on our budget, we're gonna pivot to AI and have hopefully a good discussion on that and bring you up to speed on the work in the last few months in that space. And I will apologize right up front. I would much rather be in person, but my wife tested positive for COVID 24 hours ago. And I thought it was, even though I tested negative, I did not want to take that chance. So I would be glad to come back at some other point and follow up with any in-person testimony that you would prefer. So it always seems to flow better when we're there than when we're having to do it this way. So.
Well, we appreciate your caution. Hope your wife's feeling okay. And no worries. We're glad to have you via Zoom. We're going to use the technology when we can to keep on track.
Okay, great. So with that, I'm gonna look to Kate, our CFO, to start the presentation on the materials that we submitted yesterday around our budget, and we'll start that walkthrough. Always a little harder on Zoom to know when there is a question. So Chair, please feel free to interrupt me as we're going to make sure that we don't miss any timely questions in the room.
Great. And we've all got the deck up on our devices. That tends to be how we prefer to work, so that we can see everybody on Zoom. So we can follow the deck on our own electronic devices if you do want to go off the screen share so that you can see us, or at least we can see you.
That's great. Then if you want, go ahead, Kate, and we no longer share, and I'll make sure we just have it up in front of both of us, and we will walk through this. So we'll start. We've done introductions. So on our, will be slide 2 on the deck, summary and highlights. And so we like to include this annually as a way to first, the left-hand graph is to visualize at a very high level the accounting for how ADS is funded. And so when you look at that large green block, that is all internal service funds. The blue and the yellow, the blue is also, and so when we're talking like general fund appropriation, it is that small light green block in the lower right-hand corner. So our conversation sometimes gets to be a little challenging because often what we're talking about for our budget is spending authority and versus actual dollars out of the general fund. And so Kate's going to get into that in more detail, but I just wanted to kind of set that stage and kind of lead in. One of the things that in our highlights for this year to inform you of is, this year, since the beginning, and it's in statute, ADS has tracked and reported on either direct cost savings or cost avoidances through the centralization of technology 6 years ago. We will be 6 years old on April 17th. And so this year, what we have identified through those efforts is around 7.8 million. One thing that I want to point out is that we validate that with all of our business partners. So this isn't our perspective on savings and stuff, we always make sure to circle back to our peer business offices and ensure that they recognize it too. What we've done is over the course of the life of ADS, that is now totaled just shy of 35 million, 34.7 million. And, that's each agency and department gets to, what we're hoping, right, is it gets to use that money to put back into programmatic work and spending less on the delivery or services of technology over that 5, almost 6 years now. Total base budget this year is going to be, our ask is $138,628,452. Kate will get into the details of that in a little bit. We are a agency that is just around 400 staff, just under, comprised of about 389 classified positions, and we have a leadership team of around 18 exempt professionals. One of the things another piece that we're going to dive more into later is that last year, the legislature was able to establish an IT modernization fund. So this is the idea was to have a standard means of modernizing legacy technology systems and a fund dedicated to that. And with the establishment of that, it also set it up so that the funding would come to ADS for many of these modernization projects and not directly to the business partner, the agency or department, to manage it so that the money wouldn't get lost in programmatic operational needs and things like that. So that was what we feel is a huge win. We appreciate the legislature's recognition of that, and we're going to talk in detail later about that modernization fund, what's in it for this year, and what we're asking for to add to for FY24. One of the things that we did last year during the Budget Adjustment Act was to ask for funding for the creation of a security information and event management system. The legislature approved that. We went right to work. The system is already implemented. We're now mining that data. So the way to think about this is that we have in the past kind of had logs and different means of monitoring our applications and systems across state government, but they were in most instances unique to that system. So when we'll see on the next slide, we have 1,100 systems. Having a means to look and mine all of that data to look for security holes, vulnerabilities, activity that looks out of norm was next to impossible. And so what the SIM has allowed us to do is to take all of that information and that data around activity, put it into a single solution, and use that to look for those patterns, look for things. The other thing that comes from that is it's a hosted solution, and the vendor that is operating it for us is doing it on a 24/7. So instead of us being having eyes on it when state employees were working and then kind of being blind to what could be happening in the middle of the night, we now have 24/7 coverage, looking at monitoring and watching out for nefarious activity. Global Protect rollout. This is another one that is an improvement in our security posture. So this is, we were using a product called OpenVPN for our virtual private network connectivity. This was a result of having to support a remote workforce. We're now migrating to Global Protect and rolling that out as a more secure connection for folks like myself that are sitting at home today, that are working remotely and need to have a secure connection. DMV modernization, I'll just touch on this, but that project is on schedule. The vendor and the DMV folks are working hand in hand. Currently, that schedule has a November of this year first components going live, and we would we'd love to come back and talk more about that with the project team if you have interest and dive deeper on it. UI modernization. So everybody's favorite during the pandemic was what happened to unemployment insurance and the challenges that running a program on a 15-year-old mainframe left for Vermont and Vermonters. And we have moved forward with that. That procurement is in process. I can't say much beyond that, but I would characterize it that our goal is to complete procurement or independent review. We have a touch point with the Joint Fiscal Office's IT vendor, contractor oversight, and JITOC before actually starting the project. But we're hopeful that all of those will tie together, and we'll be looking at a July 1 start date for that modernization effort. And that is moving well. All the other and I'll call them IT modernization projects, but these are the ones that over the last couple of years that the legislature has.
Senator Cooper has a quick question, Secretary.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Secretary. I wonder, in the modernization discussion you just had, you were talking about the unemployment compensation system or something broader?
So, yes, that is the unemployment. So that would be, we call it the unemployment insurance and compensation. So that is the system that
The old mainframe.
that replaces the old mainframe. Yes.
So historically, we've tried to get into mutual shared hardware, I guess, with Iowa and New Hampshire and all over the place. I assume we're opting to go individual at this point?
So actually both options are on the table in the procurement. So I really can't say much beyond that since it has an active procurement, but we are investigating both and making sure whichever direction we go in is in the best interest, and that it's something that's established and tried and true. And we are not going to be, this is not a space we want to be on the leading edge for. So we are really focused on making sure that what we're going to choose to move forward with is a well-established product with a good track record and a solid vendor behind it.
So we were stymied by cost, I think, before. Is this changed significantly enough that cost is no longer the main issue?
Well, the cost is not insignificant. It is still, from our original estimates, around 33.5 million, but we have secured the funding over the last couple of sessions. So we have the money we need to complete this modernization project.
Thank you.
Yep. And then that last bullet, which is really just a teaser for what's going to come, which is a deeper dive on what we're seeing for activity in artificial intelligence, the work of the council, and some of the kind of questions and challenges we see that we're going to need to tackle together in the state to ensure that we have the right kind of policies and guidance in place for the positive use of artificial intelligence. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So this one should look like an orange bordered dashboard. And this is something that we've included from the beginning to articulate. These are some key metrics that we have been tracking since the creation of ADS. And early on, I said we're now approaching our 6th anniversary. We're no longer a startup. And so these tend to be snapshots at the end of the year. I'm curious if it would be informational for the committee to see something that kind of charted our progress over time. We've been doing it as a snapshot to give you all a sense of where we are, right? Kind of like scale, scope, how well we're doing or not in certain areas. And now that we have 5 years of data points, would seeing that as a progression be of interest to the committee?
I think it would be helpful. One of the things that I have found challenging with the makeup and the multiple jurisdictions and the change in jurisdictions is that you're speaking to a committee where I think we only have one veteran of the old House Energy and Technology Committee, Representative Chase. We have 3 members who are new to the legislature, and the rest of us are all new to some degree to the kind of history of how the ADS came to be. And it might be helpful to take a step back while you're talking about the history and say, we used to be, my understanding is that every, state agency had their own information technology, that there was a lot of duplication and siloing. We have a number of platforms that Vermonters rely on. And, we talked about unemployment insurance, and the Department of Motor Vehicles is one I've been familiar with my entire time in and out of the legislature for a decade. So it might be good to kind of put this in that historical context for folks about just,
Sure.
How you've achieved those kind of economies of scale savings and, by having all of the state's IT mostly under one roof.
So that's a great point. And since I've been a part of it since the beginning, it doesn't feel like it's new, but I understand that this is our first time being with government operations. So prior to this administration, so 2016 and before, information technology support across the executive branch was fragmented in that each agency had their own IT team. Each agency established their own standards, did business their own way. And then there was some commodity type items like mainframe, email, some server administration stuff that was centralized in the Department of Information and Innovation. So you had this core capabilities centralized in what was called DII. And then you really had these independent teams working to support those agencies and departments. And so, as you can imagine, it created an environment of haves and have-nots. Agencies like Human Services and Transportation that had strong federal funding could stay current, could stay modern, could invest in certain areas. And then smaller departments and agencies that were relying on other funding sources may not have been able to. And so when Governor Scott took office, one of the first executive orders he issued was the creation of the Agency of Digital Services. So all IT folks under his purview in the agencies and departments were centralized into ADS. That's how we got to about the 389 staff. That did not include the independently elected officials like the Attorney General's office, Secretary of State, Auditor, Treasurer. And so that was created in January of 2017. It was considered by the legislature during that time and allowed to stand, and effectively became the Agency of Digital Services on April 17th of 2017. And so what we now have is all of those IT professionals working under a single umbrella so that we can be looking at establishing standards, adopting certain practices that are best practice. We can be looking at adjusting resources. We did this significantly during our pandemic response, including right down to myself going to the Department of Labor and working directly with Commissioner Harrington and other leadership there to help support the technology needs in the moment. And so that wouldn't have been possible pre-ADS, right? And the staff that we used to supplement the Department of Health staff to do things like data mining, understanding, putting together the reporting information. Josiah Raish, our AI director, was part of that, along with members of our chief data officers team, like the members of the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. So, we're seeing the ability to, in certain areas, to adjust resources for the immediate need. What that's also allowed us to do is to look at things and say, okay, we have prior to ADS, each agency might have a contract with the same vendor for roughly the same services. So we've been able to apply economies of scale to contract negotiations and licensing agreements, purchasing. And so as ADS, as a central entity, that's what's been driving like that number I was talking about, the 34.7 million in savings, has come a lot from taking what was separate, discrete teams, centralizing them, and then starting to manage them as one single unit. I hope that kind of gives a little bit of the backdrop. I'd be glad to answer more questions about like the world before ADS and since.
Yeah, I think that is the story, and I think if you do have the opportunity to give us sort of the snapshots over time when you next come to us, like you were suggesting, that'll help kind of lay the knowledge foundation for some of us. And I imagine we'll through working with you and getting into some of these projects and understanding more about the work of ADS, I think it'll help us sort of flesh out our understanding of how things got to be this way, and why having one ADS instead of dozens and dozens of separate IT departments made a lot of sense 6 years ago, and still makes sense today. So thank you, Secretary, for taking us down memory lane.
Yeah, and we'll compile those and be prepared to come back to talk about that more and kind of show the progression. A couple of elements on this page that I'd like to draw attention to is the first one is there's under the agency support, the application supported, there's an 1,165 that we support. So that number is still way higher than what we would like, but that number started out higher than 1,400 5.5 years ago, 6 years ago. So, part of what we've really been doing and how we're trying to drive standards and efficiencies is through the consolidation where appropriate of technology so that we can get that number down to something that is more manageable. When we started out, the way I always like to articulate it is we had one unique application for every 7 state employees to manage. That's staggering when you think about it. Across the board is to try and keep that many number of applications modernized, secure, right? And so we've done a significant amount of work there, and we have more to do. Some of the other areas is that we have 80 projects in progress. This is significant for a state the size of Vermont, right? 80 projects, and that can fluctuate as we have smaller projects come on and on, but 80 is a significant number that we're managing. And to the right of that, you'll see new initiatives versus maintenance. So this is like 93% of the projects are trying to do something that's either modernizing or providing new functionalities or capabilities. And only 7% is really spending time on maintaining the existing. So it's when you look at that, you realize that we're doing a lot of work, and a lot of it is really new to state government, but we're doing it with the same workforce that's been here for a number of years. I think we're going to pause there for a moment. Well, 2 other items is on the far right-hand side. I always like to draw attention to the 10.9 million cyber attacks thwarted. We have had a tremendous support from the administration and also from the legislature around supporting cybersecurity improvements, investments, and this is, I think, a testimony that we are in a position by which we can tell you that over the course of calendar year 22, we were able to stop 11 million direct attempts at trying to breach our environment. And that is just to kind of give a sense of scale as to how persistent the bad guys can be for a state like the size of Vermont to be dealing with that many attempted attacks over that period of time. And then percentage of staff vacancies. We, like a lot of the state workforce, went through a period of time with the pandemic. And with staff leaving, taking either jobs elsewhere, we are now under 10% for the first time vacancy. We had been running as high as 14, 15% at times. So we have really been focused on making sure we are addressing and recruiting, and we're seeing the efforts paying off, and that we are now just under 10% vacancy rate. So one of the things that we like to do is in that very lower right-hand corner is, and it's hard to distinguish because it's due to the scale of the graph, but to demonstrate each year we plotted what our budget was versus what our budget would have been if we had not identified the savings that we had worked to realize, and cost savings, cost avoidances. And so you can see now that just in this year alone, that translates to what our ask is 139 million versus without that work, it would be 146. So that 34.7 million over time this is a way to kind of visualize that as influencing our budget over the last few years. I'm going to pause there.
Any questions about total budget numbers? Not seeing any hands around the room at this point.
Well, now I'm going to turn it over to Kate Slocum, our Chief Financial Officer, and she's going to be way more engaging to listen to. So I'm going to take a pause for a minute.
For the record, Kate Slocum, Chief Financial Officer for the Agency of Digital Services. I don't know that I'm more engaging, but I will try not to bore you over the next few slides. So this in 24, we are seeking a budget, which is a $4.4 million increase over last year. We're seeking $138 million, $138.6 million. And that increase compared to last year is centered around costs that we cannot control, in that a lot of our budget is based off of the need of agencies and departments. We call it business partner demand. These are seen mostly through projects which are ongoing in the various agencies and departments which we support. Things like UI modernization or the DMV modernization, or IE&E, which lives in AHS, which I'm sure most of you have heard of in some capacity. Those kinds of projects, but they can be very small projects that have an IT focus as well. So as we looked to provide greater transparency over the last 6 years, we have been working closely with our partner agencies to identify what's your plan in the IT space over the next 5 years. Our IT leads within our agency are really it's their work that has been able to provide this level of transparency. You can see in the graph there that in fiscal year 22, we had less than 100 million that we're asking for, is $83 million that we sought for funding. Then there was a big spike in the 23 budget. That's the year that we actually started actively working on 5-year budget projections for each of our agencies. And what that did was give us greater insight into what the planned workings and projects would be over the course of the next 5 years. And this past year, we went through that process again. And I think by the showing the gradual growth there, this is what we expect to see for years to come as we update those 5-year budget projections. Again, centered really on what are the projects, the IT projects that exist for each of these agencies, and what kind of funding plan do we have for each of those projects. The other pressure in our growth is around staffing. This is entirely around annual COLA costs for our staff, as well as increased retirement costs. It's completely tied to salaries. The majority of that growth is within the partner, business partner projects, however. And I'll get into more detail on that when we go through our budget crosswalk later on. Before I move on to the next slide, are there questions?
Yeah, so Kate, one of the things that I think it would be helpful for me as kind of a new person to delving into the world that you all are in, and most of us here are, and will hopefully become a little more expert by the time we get done this first year, is to understand, when we look at those budget numbers, how much of it is the platforms like the UI and the DMV? How much of it is all the software and licenses and things that we need to have for the agencies and state employees to access certain services? And then how much of it is, the staff and the administration? So getting a handle on kind of like what does that look like, and also what the process is with JTOC, excuse me. I'm getting back in my old transportation lingo. JTOC and JITOC are just a little too similar. But just understanding how those projects that the partners bring forward as needs get translated into eventually, a budget request. Understanding the kind of story here for the committee is one of my big goals for today.
So that's a great question. So as I mentioned, we have been working with our IT leaders on building out these 5-year budget plans. And that really starts before this 5-year plan. It starts at the build out of an IT ABC form. So our agency works with our project managers and assigns them on various project needs across agency and business partner needs when there is identified a project for modernization or an IT initiative. It could be an existing IT solution that is at its life cycle end and it needs to be replaced, or it could be modernizing an existing system, or it could be a completely new system. In that process, the project managers work closely with the IT leader and then the business partners to identify what is the issue that exists, what are we trying to solve, and map out, the costing estimates associated with that project. There's a thorough vetting process that is followed through that. The business will, once the ABC form is completed, the business will bring that in front of our CIO, Secretary Naylor, and there'll be a conversation around, this is what we're trying to solve, these are the costs associated, here is our sketched out plan. And then we can move forward based on the need. Then a thorough procurement process will ensue, and from there we can start to really realize what the actual costs will be for these projects. That information is then flows into our now established 5-year budget cycle, but 5-year budget development. The information gathered from the IT ABC form is, inserted into this budget, and then year after year, we revisit it to identify that the costs are still in line. What we had expected is what we expended for the prior fiscal year. If there's been any, delays or maybe advancements that we weren't planning on, which had a budget impact, either positive or negative. We go through the update of those 5-year budget cycles in the early summer. I request that these get sorted out by mid-July so that we are prepared to compile that data into our agency request. Because as the secretary had said, and I'll get into this in a later slide, our request is really spending authority. The majority of it is spending authority. The actual appropriations that exist to fund these projects are sitting with the agencies. So in some aspect, our request that we put forward is a duplication of funding so that we can make sure that we can support the projects through IT resources, whether they be in-house or external, so that we can procure the necessary, hopefully SaaS product, so that we can procure the necessary hardware if there is any. And those costs are all passed on to the agency or department. The breakout in our—
Could I just underscore that for the committee to set a baseline understanding? So when our colleagues across the hall at appropriations get a request from the Department of Corrections, for instance, it is going to include their IT services in their budget. And you also, through the internal services funds mostly, are booking the spending authority that we're seeing in your slide deck. And so it's almost like double counting, right? Because we have one centralized agency of digital services. We have all of these business partners in state government that are buying the service internally, but it's all taxpayer dollars, right? So when we look at those things, does anybody have questions about that? Because I think this idea, when I was first a legislator, this idea of an internal service fund is really just like it's something that in order to understand any of this, you kind of have to get your brain around. And it's not an easy thing if you're new to budgeting. And I want to acknowledge that Representative Harrison, our colleague from Appropriations, is here and saying, oh yeah, ISF, sure. Does anybody want to kind of dig into that a little bit about how this kind of works in terms of how we count the money and who's requesting it? And I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page about the appropriations process that we're talking about here, and that the need for the thing is booked in each agency's budget requests, but then the spending authority is in the money that we're seeing here presented by the agency.
And I have some slides to dive into that a little bit deeper further in the presentation.
Great. This is something that when I was on transportation with Central Garage used to make my brain just like totally explode when we were talking about like the renting truck times from ourselves.
Oh,
yeah.
Yep.
So similar way to book money.
That sounds very good.
Yeah, my brain was ready to explode in 2017 when I came into ADS too.
Yeah.
Yeah, this makes a little bit more sense. I believe Representative Chase probably is the only person on the committee that kind of has his head somewhat around the moving parts because he's been on Jai Talk. But anyway, thank you very much for taking that trip into appropriations land.
One thing that I would like to add to the piece, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we have some deeper slides on modernization fund, is that the projects that have been put forth in the past couple of years for discrete funding, one-time funding, and we're like referring to them now as what's the IT modernization fund, but they started out as direct appropriations. Those go through an additional vetting process that includes the cabinet and the governor's office. So things like the DMV modernization, the unemployment insurance system modernization, the new enterprise resource planning investment that we're making, those all went through an internal, at the top levels, vetting to ensure that the organizations were ready to act upon these, that it was in the best interest of the broader executive branch. And so we can talk a little bit more about those. So those are the ones that we'll talk about in the modernization fund, or the specific projects that have been discussed in the past around discrete funding. So
So bringing it back to our budget request for 24, our proposed base request is $138.6 million. Moving on to slide 5, we are also seeking an additional $15 million in one-time appropriations, not to be conflated within our base budget, specific to IT modernization. So as many probably recall, when this secretary and myself came into the committee a few weeks back to discuss the Budget Adjustment Act, there was some movement around IT modernization dollars. In 23, they had been blended into our base unintentionally. And so we did some work with Finance and Management, as well as the Joint Fiscal Office, to look at pulling that out of the base and putting those funds in as a one-time appropriation. And in doing that, we added additional funding, which had already been identified through 23 legislation, to step down to ADS around the DMV modernization, as well as the UI modernization, which brought our one-time appropriation for fiscal year 23 up to 40 million from the 16 million, which we had included in our original base. For 24, we are seeking an additional $15 million in one-time funding under the IT modernization fund. We are looking to have this appropriated to us directly as a one-time appropriation, so it does not get blended into our base budget. And how that breaks out this year, we're looking for 10 million of that for network upgrades and re-engineering. I'll let the secretary dive into that a little bit later in our slide deck. And another 5 million for IT investments, which are specific to needs across the enterprise, which we have been unable to financially support and thus implement because funding has not been available in I would say, a universal manner. There could have been funding that may have existed for agency-specific needs, which we could have stretched to an enterprise idea, but because those funding dollars were so specific to the agency policy and practices, the funding really didn't work to apply across the enterprise. We've tried to do this in the past, and we've had some success in using agency-specific funding dollars to solution an enterprise product. But we found that as time went on and we needed to either upgrade or modernize, we ran into a lot of restrictions and were unable to take those steps due to the funding models that existed. Possibly, there were too tight parameters around it to be able to make the necessary adjustments to fit the need of the entire enterprise. And again, Sean, you can step in here and IT speak me.
No, you hit the nail on the head, Kate. And we have some slides later where we're going to get into some very concrete examples of what this is looking at. But I mean, we have, due to that internal service fund funding model, which Kate is going to take you on a primer over the next few slides and how it applies to ADS. There are certain things that we have that we can afford to maintain it, but we lack the money if we wanted to go to a different product to do that transition. And so the 5 million that we're asking for in that general IT investment bucket, and we'll see this later around what we're envisioning for that, is meant to give us to me, seems like the right use of one-time money, because we have our operating costs for the technology covered and they would be covered afterwards. But what we lack is the ability to make that investment to move from product X to product Y. And we'll give you some great examples of that in a little bit after we get through the IT service fund primer.
Before we get into that, I just wanted to ask, was the 23 million in the money that we moved into the one-time buckets that's in the FY23 bar that you have there, was that booked as part of the 134 million in the previous slide for FY23?
No. Right, so the previous slide, Kate, is our base budget and does not reflect what would be one-time appropriations from the modernization fund. So our total for 23, if you add because they're spent over multiple years, it's hard to create an apples and oranges because we're not going to spend all that money in 23. That's the money we need to do these projects that will, carry on for.
Right, and that was the whole idea, right?
Yes.
Representative Chase, I think, is gonna, or Representative Harrison, maybe, if you want to join our conversation.
If I may.
Yeah, sure. Could you get close enough so that folks can hear on Zoom though? And
Sure. Just call me Bob. This is Secretary Tim Harrison. So on your one-time request, the network upgrade, $10 million.
Yes.
And I think I understand you always have to be investing in the network for whether it's a tax or whether it's the bandwidth that keeps changing, whatever. My question to you is, as you know, there is another branch of government that would prefer to, at least initially, to do their own thing with network. And my understanding is they're eating up a lot of the bandwidth that the state currently has. If you took them out of the picture, do we still need to do a $10 million network upgrade?
Absolutely.
Or does that number change?
So that number doesn't change significantly. It would be a number of sites that would no longer be considered, but we still have, in this instance, our network was based on the world of the 1990s. Think about like mainframe connectivity, things like the internet, email, and everything was just in its infancy. We need to do this overhaul, and this overhaul, we have some statistics on this down the road, but we have like 1,700 pieces of gear managing our network across the entirety of the state, geographically and also state government. And so we would be removing a small percentage of those as part of if judiciary was to go on their own, but it is not an equivalent amount, meaning that their ask is a direct minus out of what we would need to do the same reengineering, because in some instances there are overlaps going to the same communities, things like that. So while there may be some reduction, it is not significant.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to understand where we're duplicating. That's all. Thank you.
So moving on to the structure. Moving on to the structure of the internal service fund as promised. So as we stated earlier, our agency is primarily funded through an internal service fund. And some could see that as we need to operate ourselves as a business. But I like to say that, I don't like to say, but I think it's easier to understand that we need to operate ourselves as if we have a credit card. And that credit card we have to pay back on an annual basis. So we are seeking annually a credit limit, essentially, to be able to pay for the services to support our IT needs. And we recover or pay that bill through a series of 5 different recovery streams. They're identified, and you may hear about these. The Appropriation Committee hears about them more frequently. But these recovery streams are identified as the ADS allocation, the ADS service level agreement, ADS timesheet expenses, telephony billing, and bespoke charges. And I have a slide dedicated to each one of these because you're probably saying, what are these? Like, how do I tell the difference? So moving on to slide 7, our ADS allocation covers those very basic fundamental needs that are necessary to support IT for an enterprise need. Things like network connectivity, cybersecurity, the Windows operating systems that every user has on their machines. The project management team around basic reporting, overall reporting. In the cybersecurity space, we're looking at incident handling. So if there is an incident that occurs within an agency or department affecting our network, our security team can come in and they can help to triage where necessary. Some penetration testing, light penetration testing is included in this. We have our firewall and our certificates associated with the firewalls that are covered. So these are really the overarching costs that exist in order to maintain a sound information technology support for all of the agencies. Not every user will utilize what falls into the allocation, but it is there and available for them to utilize. And it is uniform across all customers. That amount is identified annually. This year, it's just over $11 million that we have identified to fall into the ADS allocation. And the cost is distributed across each user base by headcount. So we work with finance and management to identify how many staff members they have in an agency or department, full-time classified staff member that they have in each agency or department, and they pay based off of the number associated in their department. Moving on to slide 8, our internal service fund. So this leads us into our demand side of our budget. The service level agreement is the agreement that we have with each agency and department user base for the specific needs of that agency or department within our enterprise offerings. So things like private cloud or Microsoft, the Microsoft application, mainframe is included in here. What we're able to do is to identify the needs of the agency in working with the agency around how many licenses they need in the space, what kind of usage they have in the space, if they need dedicated staff on these enterprise applications that are really specific to the needs of that agency or department. And we come up with an annual estimate for each agency, and then annually we bill back what the actual cost was. So an agency might come forward and say, I need 1,000 Microsoft licenses to support my workforce. And so we'll build that into the estimate. When the bill comes, maybe they used only 900 and we bill them for 900. Or maybe they used 1,200 and we bill them for 1,200. So it's really based off of consumption. This has been able to give us a lot more transparency in the agency use and need of these enterprise products. I'll be honest, it is a source of contention annually because, over the years, there hasn't been a lot of understanding as to how their use translate into the bill, but we've been putting greater focus on this, working more proactively with agencies and departments to really identify what these costs would be expected to be, what the costs will be as they build out projects, and just trying to be a lot more transparent around the needs of the agency. We really want them to own this and understand, the costs associated with the needs of their agency, of their demand.
Representative Waters Evans has a question.
When you say it's a source of contention between who?
I'm sorry.
I think Representative Waters Evans wanted to know, when you say this process is contentious, who are the parties that are having friction about it?
Sure. So in the past, we've seen that agencies will be presented an annual bill and not really have an understanding of why. Like, why is this bill so high? Why I don't understand the usage associated with it. So we've taken an approach over the last few fiscal years to try and confront that early on, to identify, this is what a user license costs in the space, and it's associated to potentially your cloud need. There is a reliance on the cloud as you add more users in one of the products we offer. So trying to make those connections so that there is less concern and frustration when these bills show up. We also, in the last couple of fiscal years, have provided projections to agencies for their coming fiscal year. That wasn't something that was done in the past. We're getting better and better at this each year, and trying to educate more as time goes on, so that it's not as painful as of a process. It's been quite painful in the past, and we recognize that, and we're trying to rectify that problem. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, to add to that, one of the ones that's always hard is that we have, like, say, license agreements with Microsoft, and we have an opportunity once annually to make adjustments. If an agency or department, which is where we, the folks we provide service to, one of the challenges is license recapture, right? We will provide, it's like, oh, you've used X number of licenses over the course of this year. And they're like, oh, these 5 people left in October. But if we aren't notified, and therefore we can't also release those licenses back to the vendor, we're still on the hook for them. So that's one of the areas a lot of times is that kind of administrative follow through that can just lead to friction and understanding and of the different billing models. And like Kate says, we're trying to move from reactive to proactive on that, and trying to get ahead of it and explain to the agencies and departments how this works better, and what levers they have to pull in advance of them getting their bill to make sure that it is more reflective of what they're expecting.
That makes sense to everybody. This is a problem that we have in my day job frequently, about paying for licenses of people who don't exist, and then not being able to provide licenses for new people that are hired. So state government's not alone, being proactive. Hope we make some progress on that.
Chair, I'd love to talk about if what your day job is doing to try and figure out license management, because I think that is one of the nuts that's really hard to crack in any large organization. I mean, it's a burden for all of us.
Understood. So what I just wanted to set some expectations. So I'd like to try to keep questions to clarifying questions so that Kate and the secretary can make it through their deck. We'll take a short break so everybody can stretch and use the restroom, and then we'll get into the artificial intelligence testimony after that, if that works for you, Mr. Secretary.
It absolutely does.
So moving on to slide deck number 9. So we have specific staff across our agency that we recover their costs, their hourly costs, through what we call a timesheet model. This varies depending on the work that's being provided. There's 2 groups. The first group encompasses our project management team, project managers and business analysts assigned to specific projects across the agencies. It also includes any enterprise architects that we might need, any security analysts that might be necessary. And those are really identified and through that IT ABC process that I talked about earlier, they bill back for actual hours worked at a rate of $88 an hour. It might seem high, but that's an all-inclusive rate. That covers not just their salary and benefits, but it covers any indirect costs that we have associated with staff, any overhead costs that we might have, any licensing that individual might have necessary to perform their functions. And we only bill for hours worked. We have another rate that is applied to our non-enterprise application support individuals. So the IT individuals that we actually have still embedded within agencies to support their agency's specific applications and needs. This can be, someone at VDOL that's working on the UI modernization project as an IT specialist, or at DMV, or any number of the other projects that we have. But it also could be for maintenance and operation of those applications which exist. And those are billed out at $84 an hour. You might ask why the difference? Well, overall, project managers, enterprise architects, security analysts, they're more expensive, considerably more expensive than our IT professionals that are maintaining these applications. So how we went about doing this 5 years ago was to group those classifications into 2 different categories, figure out what the average cost was per employee. Then we came forward and identified, well, we know not all of these hours are going to be billable. It's not going to be a straight 20/80 annually. There's time off that each employee has. There's sick days that each employee has. There's training. There's, hours spent on maybe managing other employees or working on functions that really aren't specific to the need of the department or agency. So we on average, we tallied up what our target billable amount should be, and we came with a total amount of 1,412 hours annually. And that's the target number that we also supply to our agencies. So as the agencies are building out their costs annually for their budget, we tell them, please budget at $84 an hour for 1,412 hours. It usually works out pretty accurately. We also found that this rate cleanly equates to what the agencies would have spent if they were paying for straight salaries and overhead. So, it does look like a high hourly rate, but it's actually not. And it's actually a savings over bringing in outside vendors. We'd be lucky to bring in an outside vendor to do any of this work for less than $100 an hour. A lot of our vendors are charging upwards of $200 to $250 an hour. So it is definitely a cost-saving measure for agencies when we can deploy ADS staff to their projects and needs. We do bill that out on a monthly basis, where the other 2 recovery models I talked about are billed out on an annual basis. So there's the ability for agencies and departments to really see these expenditures in real time. They can recapture costs associated to any federal funding that's available to them. And that's another big reason why we identified this rate model, so that if there was federal funding or special project funding sitting on the table, we could, the state as a whole could capitalize on those costs and not run into the time constraints associated, especially with federal funding. And the last one I'm going to talk about here, the last 2 I'm going to talk about is telephony and bespoke. So these are also demand-driven needs. So telephony is just what you would think. It's the VoIP and telephone, analog telephone services that are provided for agencies and departments. Those are billed back on a line basis. The agency needs a line, they use a line, they pay for a line. And then our bespoke. This is a term that isn't always recognized by anyone outside of fashion. So if you're in the fashion world, you would know what bespoke is. It basically is tailored to meet the needs that you have. So you need a suit tailored for you, it's bespoked. So we applied that to the unique needs and demands of our agencies. So an agency comes forward and they say, hey, I need this item. It's only specific to the policies that exist within my agency. It might be like a permitting project that has very specific requirements. And we work with them to identify, is there an existing software that's out there that we could procure for you and just pass those costs on as a one-for-one? Or is there a specific hardware that you need to fulfill this? Also, any of the computers that are used by our various agencies across the enterprise, they're billed back on a bespoke basis. We procure the product, we use commodities of scale to get the best pricing, and then we pass along that cost to the agencies or departments as they need them. So they might need a monitor, they might need a desktop, they might need a laptop. Let's hope it's a laptop. Due to encryption. And it's a one-for-one. It's tailored to what they need, and we do not mark up the charge on that. So that's in a very quick nutshell, that's what an ISF is. It essentially is used for us to respond to the needs and requests of our customers. Sometimes it is more general and it falls into the allocation. But the majority of our budget is in that demand side. It's in the SLA, the applications that they want to utilize, or it's specific to the needs of the department to make sure that they can run efficiently. And I hope I explained it.
I think you did a great job, Kate. And I'm trying to imagine keeping track of the laptops, desktops, and phone lines for every single state agency and employee that needs them. So glad you're doing it and not me.
The one last thing I'll add in this is that we did recently invest in a new tool that will help us to provide greater transparency in IT spend. We're still implementing it. It's not go live yet. Our hope is to have it go live for 24. And what it will do is actually be able to provide visualizations, better understanding for our customers to identify where they're spending their money in the IT space and what recovery stream we're working within. We're very excited about this, and I can't wait to come back to the committee and show the results of it, probably next session, but it's pretty exciting for us. So moving on to slide 11, I'm going to hand it back over to my secretary around the IT Modernization Fund.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. We've talked about a lot of this over the course of the earlier slides, so I'm going to just kind of quickly go over it. So the history of the Technology Modernization Fund and why it matters to us. I'm on slide 11. It was established in the last session, Act 185. Two big differences is one is instead of the funding going to the agencies and departments that have the business process, it is administered by the Agency of Digital Services on their behalf to ensure that it's applied to the appropriate technology to modernize the processes they need. We quickly went over in BAA, but just to revisit that, the initial amount last year was to fund 4 projects at $16.7 million. Those were our enterprise resource planning, workplace information management system, fire safety modernization, and case management system. Then in addition, there was 25 million in change added at the end of the session. So the DMV modernization second phase of that project and the what is needed to fund the unemployment insurance modernization was contingent upon excess revenues at the end of last fiscal year. Those were realized. And so then in budget adjustment, the monies to do those 2 projects were transferred to the modernization fund to continue those. Now, let's come to FY24. What do we want to do? So I alluded to this a little bit earlier when you were asking Chair about how do we prioritize some of the projects you see. And these are really done in the past and will continue to be done as at the highest levels of the cabinet and the governor's office to vet candidate projects. One of the things that we did this year was, with the amount of funding and projects that are in flight from the previous two legislative sessions, we did not feel that there was a business side project that we could move forward that wasn't going to be in some way competing with those projects that were already in flight. So what we did was we looked internally this year to and when I say internally, I mean to ADS, where were opportunities and where was the demand to modernize within operations of the technology to serve everyone better. And so when we looked at that, that's where we came up with, and I'm on slide 12 now, $10 million to modernize, the $10 million budget request to modernize the network and security infrastructure, and a $5 million generalized IT investment fund. We've spoken a little bit to that, but I'd like to go deeper, but I don't want to go too fast. So I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions.
So this is the one-time money. So we've kind of set aside the base. We're looking at the budget request for 15 million in one-time money in these two buckets.
Thank you for clarifying. Yes, this is.
Anybody have any questions? I'm always about kind of making sure we're all we're all following here. So thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think.
So now slide 13. So this gives you we wanted to provide just a little bit of an overview about our current network. So our current network, it takes about 1,700 devices to manage it. So this is everything from switches to routers to firewalls and wireless access points and all of it. So as you can imagine, when 1,700 devices, spread that geographically across the state of Vermont to the places the executive branch and others that we provide service to have offices, it is a network that goes from corner to corner. On any given day, we'll have 12,000 devices connected to that network. One of the things that came out of the pandemic, right, as we're all aware of, is I would say the acceleration of a hybrid workforce. We went remote immediately, and we've transitioned back to this hybrid environment where, some folks work remotely a portion of the day at a time, some are in person. In order to facilitate that in a secure manner, we need to provide, a virtual private network connection in to ensure the safe access of information. On any given day, we're seeing in around 4,000 users connected that way. So it was not a demand or even a component. It was so insignificant prior to the pandemic that volume that this additional kind of, I'll say, strain on the network has added to why we're here today, asking for the 10 million in one time. It is ADS owned through acquisition, right? So with the creation of ADS, it was assumed was all the responsibilities of the individual agencies and departments. And as you might imagine, they were all done to the same standard. And so there is this aggregation. I like to describe it as our network is like an old Vermont farmhouse. And as the family grew, additions were put on, and we are at the point now where we need a whole new house. We've kind of, all of it doesn't work for us anymore. It's based on, the 1990s world. Like we were talking, and, you're all probably younger, so you don't remember like having to, your biggest thing was connecting to the mainframe and just kind of screen sharing and whether or not the function key was going to work across the network, or, things like Lotus Notes or GroupWise for email was really just like work group or inter office connectivity. That's the world that this network was born from. Not one that envisioned cloud, not one that envisioned most of the resources being dispersed, across the country in data centers and things like that. So where we're at is this environment is no longer sustainable, right? It doesn't meet the needs. We will acknowledge we're not providing the performance we want to provide the performance on. We consistently on certain days of the week during certain windows see utilization at 100%. That is not where we want to be, because that one, it inhibits everyone that we're providing this service to from being as productive as possible. And two, it is going to be the limitation that keeps us from continuing to modernize. So if we can't get our fundamental foundational service like the network, both performant and secure, that is going to hold us back more than anything for the future. And as we talked, it creates performance inconsistencies and equities for user experience. So that's where we're at. That's kind of the straight shot as to the environment that we're dealing with today. There's no questions. I'm going to kind of move on to what we want to accomplish with this. All right.
Any questions? I love the farmhouse analogy. I think helps a lot of us who haven't been in your profession to kind of understand. Also, the reference to things like Lotus Notes had me smiling. We're going way, way back.
Well, I was thinking about it last night in preparation for this, and we're talking a network that was designed for like when Windows NT and Windows for work, right? When actually networked Windows PCs were becoming a thing, right? Not the world that we live in now. I mean, probably all of us have a more modern home network than, when we consider all those legacy things. So it's an interesting way to look back at it. Yeah, and you'll find I use analogies a lot. It tends to help, and the farmhouse one to me is just like a great corollary. And we're at the point where we've outgrown the farmhouse, and it's beyond remodeling, and we need to build anew, and that's what we're proposing. And these are going to be the things that we're focused on, right? And so we know what we want it to do, right? We want it to provide us the resiliency, redundancy, scalability, security, and stability that we need. We want to be able to ensure that no matter where you are in the state, you can have a consistent experience, that it's performant, that there are not limitations to doing work just because of the office you sit in, or that you're or the place that you work, right? Your location does not factor into it. We want to be able to prioritize and adjust performance based on workloads. Case in point, I spent a good chunk of my career at transportation, where things are very engineering and geospatial work is very computational intensive. It uses a lot of large files and things like that. The demand in an area like that is going to be different than our own security division's needs, who's going to be not working with large files locally. They're going to be wanting to reach out and have, their fingers and tentacles reaching out to many, many devices and monitoring what our network is doing, what our security position is in the moment. And so being able to recognize that not all workloads, not all demands on the network are the same, and therefore ensuring that we're providing the right performance at that time. And most importantly, right, that the design will not be, the next network cannot be carrying the limitations of the legacy that we have now. And, I'll give a quick background because we're going to go into the budget considerations next. We have carried through, and I'm going to refer back to Kate's presentation a few slides ago, where she talked about the allocation. And the allocation is our kind of ubiquitous services distributed by head count. You know, how many people work in an agency or department, that's the fee you pay. That's how we manage the network. We have been managing that on a 7-year life cycle. So what we have built into that allocation is the money to refresh annually 1/7, or is that 16.7% of our network at any given time. Well, if we're in need of replacing our farmhouse, we can't do it 1/7 at a time. It's just that's not going to work, right? We're at that point by which we need to make that substantial capital expenditure to modernize it and build out a parallel network. We have the operating cost to cover it moving forward in our base, right? And so that's why we feel like this is a great use of a one-time modernization money, is to get us to that new standard, that new expectation, that new network that doesn't carry any of the limitations of what we currently have in our legacy. All right. Pause if there's any questions before we go to slide 15.
Not seeing any hands here, I think.
Okay. Great. So that's where we're going to slow down. I was talking really fast up until now. This is from at the conceptual level, our we'll call it schedule and estimate. So let's walk through the schedule. So this work is, to do it right, is a 2-year effort, and to ensure that we're not carrying forth any of the biases or limitations of our current network. So what we know is we know what we want the next generation network to be. We don't know yet how to do that. So we're going to start off with that first 5 months really settling in on taking those requirements that we have, those expectations, those demands we're going to have, and working with a partner that has the resources, that does this daily, to really sit down and say, okay, if you're going to build to meet these expectations, this is what the design for the state of Vermont looks like. And so that is what we're really envisioning in the first 2 phases, to land on an architectural design. This is when we're going to replace that farmhouse, this is sitting down with this person that's designing that replacement, right? Understanding how many bedrooms do we want? How many bathrooms do we want? We need to be able to articulate that and then have the architecture come back to us in something that really checks all those boxes, meets those needs, and gives us something to build from. We then want to go and take that and validate it. I mean, this is a huge shift for us. This is not like just trying to incrementally move in a different direction. This is a wholesale change. So we want to take that, apply it to 2 specific areas, and validate it. Make sure that the assumptions, that the design, that everything we've done up until this point is going to yield the results that we want, right? That we're going to have that redundancy at the sites, that we're going to have that ability to adjust performance, that we're going to be able to do a quick security assessment and ensure that our posture is improved and not we'll put ourselves at risk. So we want to do that as part of phase 3. And then once we have that phase 3 validation and adjustment, because I will almost guarantee that it will yield some things that we will want to make adjustments to, we will then take it and over the 2nd year, roll this out statewide. So that's the high level plan. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into the details around that. So that is why we're approaching this as a 2-year plan. The second is the cost. So I spoke to how we budget on a 7-year cycle for replacement, which has worked to keep things modern. So we use that as the basis for, okay, what is it we're going to need for hardware and software investments? So we took what that dollar amount was annually, extrapolated it over 7 years and came up with our estimate of $8.2 million. Some broad research has yielded some professional services will run 1.6 million. Obviously, these have a little bit of a factor of safety on them because we're working from conceptual estimates and designs. More detail will yield tighter estimates. And then the last is the project support cost. So this is $2.5 million that will identify funds for ensuring that we have a project manager assigned to this to continue to manage the project in a timely manner, that we have a business analyst available to go so that we can engage them at sites to learn what the true requirements in business need is. And we're not just looking at the technical aspects of what was there, right? But to actually understand how an information worker may be working at that site to ensure that we're considering all of those things. It includes enterprise architecture. But the big one that it includes is we've specifically allocated funds for a full-on security assessment post-implementation. So we envision that as falling in at the tail end of phase 3 during the pilot, when we know we've got a solid thing, is to point a security vendor at it and have them, crawl every nook and cranny and ensure that we are not doing something that's going to put us at risk down the road. We know that application security assessments can run around $35,000. So, we've estimated about $750,000 in order to be able to do that across an entire network. But we don't want to move forward with something that is going to compromise all the work that we've done to date to ensure that we are secure, right? And we want it to actually improve upon that, our level, our security posture. So that adds up to 12.3 million. And so this is where I wanted to share a little bit of the math. Our ask is for 10 million because what we budget for annually in our allocation is around just under $1.2 million, $1.17 million. And since we're anticipating a 2-year life cycle for this project, we plan on not investing any more money in this current infrastructure. So we would use both years worth of allocation funds to make up that difference, which, as you can see, yields, based on our preliminary estimates, uncovered project cost of $9.96 million. That was a lot to digest, so I want to stop for a minute.
So I had a couple of questions. Yeah. It seems to me that one of the key things is that with phase 3, those 2 agencies that are going to be the first to experience the new rollout, assuming this all moves forward, have you identified which agencies those are or have criteria for who they're going to be?
We have not. We're a little premature. We know, based on what we want out of it, who likely candidates would be, but I think the reality is going to be that the design, that architectural design, and how that looks will mean we're going to have to look for agency partners that test like all aspects of it. So, it may be a transportation that has a geographically dispersed workforce is one of them, but also has a heavy engineering group. But they're a large agency. So, we may be looking to something more like a Department of Children and Families, so it's going to depend, I think, on that final design as to who those candidates are for those pilot deployments. But everyone that I would say that we're providing services to right now are candidates. We would consider them. We haven't narrowed it down at this point.
Other questions? I think my
tank is pretty well topped off.
Yeah, I think we've hit folks who are new to your agency and services with a lot of information this morning. So we'll get through your last couple of slides, take a quick break, and then talk about the world of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate
Sure, we'll
the
have more
patience.
questions.
Yeah, I appreciate the patience, and it's this is a lot that we're trying to share with you today. So no questions there. I'll go on to the second one. So
I have one, but it might not be.
Yeah, go ahead. This is why we're here.
Thanks. I'm new, so this may be a question that, but just to continue your house metaphor.
Yep.
Frequently, it will cost like twice as much and take twice as long for a construction project on a house. So I'm wondering if these estimates and these numbers are things that are fixed in advance, or if there's the potential that they're going to, cost a lot more and you're going to need, more money along the way, or if these are figures that are kind of set before you begin the project.
So we're feeling confident in the numbers we're putting forth right now. We've validated some of our current cost, what the equipment is, what we're seeing. What I can't do right is if 12 months from now we have a spike in network infrastructure like the same that we had with lumber, that I can't predict, but it does reflect kind of like the current market, which has absorbed some of those. I won't say absorb, but I mean, it has already factored in some of the higher costs that we've seen over the last 18 to 24 months.
Thanks.
All right, I think we're good.
All right. The penultimate slide, 16. Modernizing IT investments. So when Kate was explaining the different ways we get money, bill back to all the agencies and departments, one of the challenges we have is finding opportunity to make investments for those technologies that are really not assigned to any agency or department. And so what we're asking for in the second one-time fund is $5 million that's not I won't say assigned to any specific project, but is a roll-up of the ones that are envisioned here and others. So a perfect example is the second one there is the ticketing, project management, inventory management tool. ADS has the funding to cover the annual cost of a help desk ticketing system. We would like to move to something else. What we lack is a means to cover the cost of moving from product X to product Y. And that's not something that's applied to any one agency or department. And it is a one-time need, so it doesn't feel appropriate to spike the different funding models for just a period of time, for just 1 year. So what we're looking to do is say, okay, since we have a very small piece of the general fund that comes to Vermont Center for Geographic Information, can we get monies to start modernization or modernize areas where we have the investment and we have the cost covered for ongoing, but what we're lacking is that one-time cost to move from one product to another. So the Tanium product is in our cybersecurity space. We know that we can carry the cost because we have a competitor on board now, but this product is doing significantly more. Once we shift, we can cover the annual cost, but what we're lacking is the monies to do the move from product A to product B. Monitoring, we've built into our base the ability to cover licenses, but we need that up front. Often they're like the implementation costs, whether it's personal services. And then we have a couple of projects that we really want to see get off the ground that are really externally facing and centric to citizens and municipalities, which is like the broad executive branch, no one agency or department. And so what we're looking to do is have that money available to act as the seed for that. And I'm going to stop right there and see what there is for questions.
I think questions might emerge on some of this, but I think we get the general idea of wanting of the jump you're trying to make with this one-time investment.
Thank you. And I'm going to let Kate walk through the last slide, which is our the budget crosswalk, and then we'll be ready to wrap this portion.
Yeah, so I'm sure this is the slide you all have been waiting for. It's the slide that the appropriations committees look forward to reviewing every year. But this basically shows the movements at a more granular level of our budget from prior year to current year. So if you start at the top of this chart, it shows what the original base appropriation was for ADS. It walks through any budget adjustments that were sought and approved. We did have $3.3 million in general fund that was allocated to us, appropriated to us through last year's budget adjustment request, which modified our general fund request greatly in a space where we usually have very little general fund. That was the implementation of the SIM, which we spoke to in the first slide around cybersecurity needs. So starting off with a base budget request, we walk through a couple of different changes. So as I had mentioned earlier, all of our pressures in our budget are either around demand project needs or staffing expenditures. So our first line, it says allocation increase. So this is the increase that we're seeing within our allocation overall, which covers those enterprise needs, things like our generalized cybersecurity, our network, the staff that do a lot of the enterprise administration, enterprise meaning entire ADS customer base. Majority of those increases are attributable to staffing costs, but because we did have to bake in the licensing costs ongoing for the SIM project, there's a little bit of increase around that as well. The next line item is really the next few line items are really in our demand space. So salary and benefits for those individuals that either live within the service level agreement activities or the timesheet project activities, telephony. It's really, completely attributable to retirement and salary increases for our staff that are not supported by the allocation. The same goes for demand operating increases. We saw some increases here, specific around increase on hardware costs for our staff, some software cost increases. The next two line items are adjustments that finance and management made after our budget was submitted. So the budget process within the executive branch is that the internal service funds need to present what their budget need is early in the budget cycle. And then once all of those numbers are calculated, agencies and departments are given their internal service fund targets. We, like any other agency and department, have other internal service fund targets to match. Things like fee for space or general liability. Those are internal service costs that ADS has to pay to buildings and general services. So we build our budget based off of estimates, and then finance and management comes back a couple of weeks later after we submit our budget and said, here's the actual numbers you need to bake into your budget. They, once they did that, they usually will also allocate in turn some general fund dollars to make up for those increases. So that's what you're seeing in the lines of internal service fund increase and DFM review increase. Not very much money, but that's attributable to the small amount of general fund that we have in our budget. And all of our general fund is used towards the data team, specifically in the VCGI space. So if you remember, in budget adjustment, we came forward and we asked for $1.7 million to support some of our GSI needs. This is for that team. We use it entirely for that team. The next few lines are specific to agency demand. And the majority of these increases, or in some cases decreases, are centered around the projects that exist within each of those agencies. We do a review annually through our 5-year budget exercise to identify what would be the needs for the coming fiscal year. And this is a reflection, either up or down, of what is needed in each one of those spaces. You see the AOA line at $6.2 million. This is because of the ERP project that's really ramping up now. We are starting to see expenditures in FY23 around that, pretty minimal, but FY24 we expect to see the project really running fast and a great jump in expenditures. And same for VDOL. As we spoke before, we were talking about the UI project. There's UI going on, but there's a number of other projects that will be ramping up in the VDOL space, which we project to start to occur in 24. So those are all reflective of those projects which exist in our 5-year budget plans that we worked with each agency or business partner, as we like to refer to them as. And then there's a decrease that you see on our chart of the $3.3 million. So this was, again, we were granted $3.3 million in budget adjustment last year, specific to the SIM project, and we just have to back it out for our 24 request because that was seen as a one-time appropriation. And then the expectation was that ADS would work to build it into our allocation costs thereafter, which we have done through our allocation increase. This brings our total ask to $138 million for 24 as our base budget. And you can see primarily all of that spending is expected to happen through the internal service fund space. The special funds that you see are 2 specific funds that support the VCGI activities. There's a regional and the Municipal and Regional Planning Commission fund, and then there is a VCGI specific fund. And that's a high level walkthrough of the crosswalk. I know you guys are all kind of getting a little exhausted at this point.
So what I would like to do is encourage the committee to take a look through the presentation, come up with things that we have questions about, and I definitely would like to invite you all back as we're going through the process of digging a little bit deeper. But I think you've given us a really great high level of what ADS is all about, the specific budget requests, and then I imagine we'll have questions to look under the hood the next time we have you in and learn a little bit more about some of these specific recommendations. What I'd like to do now is give the committee a break since we've been going for a while, and then switch gears to the AI presentation